What's up, everybody? Today I wanted to talk about the most popular colored stone cut of all time. Last time we looked at the brilliant cut and the step cut, and I wanted to kind of think about what if these two most popular cuts came together and had a baby. Today we're going to be looking at the mixed cut on the gem cutter's craft. So if you want to understand the story of the mixed cut, we need to understand a bit of history behind the step cut and the brilliant cut. So I wanted to get out some essential books and resources to help us figure that out. So first things first, I wanted to know, when did the brilliant cut come out? If we want to put a date on the mixed cut, we really need to know the brilliant cut, because you can't have a mixed cut without the brilliant cut. So I'm checking out Diamonds by Jack Ogden. This is an essential book on the history of diamonds, diamond cutting, and everything about their history. So page 168, Jack Ogden tells us the brilliant cut appeared soon after the mid-1600s, but its origins are still debated. So somewhere in the 1550s, we're having the very, very early brilliant cuts. 1550 would have been very early origins. Even 1650, we're still in the early days of the brilliant cut. So somewhere between the 1550s and the 1650s, this is a cut that's gaining popularity and starting to be used in diamonds. So my next resource is going to be London's Lost Jewels, Hazel Forsyth. This is a book about the Cheapside hoard. Another really great, informative book. In here, there's a lot of really great photos. She doesn't talk too much about specific cuts, but she does show a lot of great cuts in the photos of the hundreds of 17th century jewels from this London Cheapside hoard. Here we can see not quite a brilliant mix with a step cut, but definitely a step cut bottom with a sort of rose cut top. So we are mixing triangles and rectangles. So we've got some kind of a mixture of cuts here. So I wanted to start there because I looked all through all the stones of the Cheapside hoard. There are no quintessential mixed cuts, a brilliant top with a step cut bottom. So we can kind of say 1650 London fire, and before, no one was really using a mixed cut. So looking at the early history of the step cut, I've got a few different pieces of jewelry to show you. We know that faceting started somewhere in the late 1300s, early 1400s. That's when the first technology started to appear with a flat lap. So we can't assume that we're going to find any faceted stones before that time. So I went back through my whole archive of faceted stone photos to try to find what are the earliest step cuts that I could find. Now we know that some of the first cuts were called table cuts. So they would have been basically one step on top, one step on the bottom, but I wanted to see, when do we actually start seeing multiple steps happening? And so some of the earliest ones I can find were in the Ashmolean Museum. So these are photos that I took a few years back when I was in England, and they really do show us some very good examples of very typical step cut styles. So here we've got a garnet in gold ring. This is from the late 16th century, so we're in the end of the 1500s. We can see very clearly a table, a step around the table, and in the other photo we can very clearly see at least two steps on the bottom of the stone with a keel in this red garnet. So early step cut, late 1500s. We have another one from the same period, a zircon in gold. This one, because I took the photo with a flash, you can very clearly see inside of the stone. It's a symmetrical square with two steps that come to a point. So we've got four symmetrical sides with two steps each that come down into a culate point. Very early, perfect use of the step cut. So again, 1500s. And finally, same period, 1500s, we've got either a pink topaz or a ruby in a gold ring, again from the Ashmolean Museum. And when we look into the photo with the flash, we can see very clearly that there's multiple steps on the top and the bottom of the stone. So we can pretty much set the date as the middle of the 1500s at least, if not older. So we're going back more than 500 years for the step cut, 400 years for the brilliant cut. So we definitely have hundreds of years that have gone by in faceting history between the introduction of the step cut and the introduction of the brilliant cut. So when did these two styles start to become combined? One of the earliest ones I can find is this English watch. We can very clearly see in the center stone we've got a noticeable brilliant cut pattern on top with a very big spread and a very big table, which allows us to easily see inside of the stone where we've got multiple steps on the bottom with a keel line. So we can say definitively at least that sometime in the 1700s, people started mixing up these styles. So maybe within 100 or 200 years after the brilliant cut really got popular, somebody decided to mix these up in colored stones. So I wanted to go a little further in our primary references and see what could I find about the mixed cut. Who's written about it? What have they said? So in 1838, we've got a book called Treatise on Gems. This is an American book printed in New York by a Louis Feuchtwanger. So he's got some photos in here of different types of cutting, including the mixed cut. We can see here his drawing for the mixed cut. A little bit crude, but we can definitely see what's going on here. He tells us the mixed facet cut is a compound of brilliant and pavilion cuts. The first being on the crown, it is very favorite cut for colored gems and contributes much in raising the luster. Interesting. He also tells us about the step cut, the planes which are long and small, decrease towards the table and collet, and terminate in steps. The crown usually has 2, the collet 4 or 5 facets on each side. The form of the stones may be of 4, 6, 8, or 12 sides, or may be long or round. The cut is particularly applicable to colored gems as it reflects the light in a high degree, by which the play of color is much raised. And it is at all events to be preferred in the collet of colored gems, even to those brilliants in pavilion. The crown may be of any form whatever. So in both of these descriptions, he's telling us the preferred version of cutting for colored stones has a step cut bottom. And he even says in the step cut section, the crown can be whatever. It doesn't really matter. So there's already an understanding that you can mix up these two cuts. So this is 1838. This is the earliest reference I could find for the mixed cut. There could be earlier ones out there. So my next reference that I wanted to look at comes from London in 1850. This is Turning and Mechanical Manipulations by Holtzapfel. This is one of my favorite old cutting books. There isn't really much older of a book that's written as almost an instruction manual for cutting. He's got about 90 pages in this book. It's actually a book about lathes and wood turning and metal turning on lathes. But he has a whole section on gem cutting and how to use the lathe in order to cut gems. And he's got some great drawings in here. So this is 1850. We can see very clearly step cut, mixed cut, and double cut, where you've got a mixed cut with a double step top. And so he tells us in the book that, this is one of the kinds of cutting styles that's there, that's available. So Holtzapfel tells us the brilliant cut, variously modified, is the form of faceting most generally adopted for the fronts of gems and pastes, which are glass synthetic simulant stones. And the backs of these stones are mostly trapped or cut in squares. So even here, when he's talking about the brilliant cut, as a colored stone cutter, he's telling us the backs of the stones are always cut as a step cut or a trap cut, as they called them back then. The brilliant cut was only the form for the face of the stone. So this is interesting because when we think about the brilliant cut now, the brilliant cut has a very specific back and bottom of the stone that matches the top. So it's kind of interesting that in the 1850s, they didn't really think about it that way, at least for colored stones. I'm sure if we looked at an 1850 book about diamonds, we'd see a different story because diamonds never used a step cut for the back of the stone. Okay, let's keep on going. We've got a few more references that give us a little bit of clues about the origin and the ideas of early mixed cuts. So here we're in 1867. This is Diamonds and Precious Stones. This is also in London. Harry Emanuel. So he's got another drawing of a round mixed cut here. We can see it's got a multi-step bottom with a double-step crown. Brilliant. He tells us the mixed or brilliant top cut. In this form, the gem preserves the trap cut up to the girdle, while the upper part has an elongated brilliant cut. He doesn't really tell us why, but he definitely does tell us it's there, it's existing, it's mixed. He also talks a bit about the trap or the step cut. He tells us this is the most usual, besides being the most advantageous form of cutting emeralds and other colored stones. In this mode of cutting, the facets run longitudinally round the stone from the table to the girdle and from the girdle to the cullet. There are generally only 2 or 3 steps from the table to the girdle, whilst the number of steps from the girdle to the cullet depends on the thickness and depth of color of the stone. So we can see a lot of repetition here. The same ideas are being presented by different authors in different periods, pretty much telling us in these early days, or let's say in these older days, the normal way to do it was either step cut on top and step cut on bottom, or brilliant cut on top with a step cut on bottom. So 1903, we've got another reference from America. This is Precious Stone, a book of reference for jewelers. W.R. Cattell. He tells us that, as a rule, the step cut in one of its many forms is most suitable. This has been improved somewhat of late by cutting the upper portion with brilliant facets. Some object to the innovation, but they certainly help with the natural luster of the stone and increase its brilliancy. He even gives us an example. He says, Mr. E. Passmore of Boston has succeeded in preserving the color and enhancing the brilliancy of many fancy stones by cutting them entirely brilliant. In the course of his experiments, he has perfected and patented some very ingenious devices for securing mechanically right proportions and exact faceting. This gentleman has done for colored stones what Henry D. Morse did for diamonds, raised them in the scale of beauty by improving methods of manipulating and cutting, and he has shown that some of the finer specimens of cheaper varieties of stones may be made to rival in beauty others far more costly. So this is interesting because he's telling us this as if it's new information that we hadn't seen over the last 50 years. But in America, maybe this is a new idea. So mixing the step cut with the brilliant cut, even though some are objecting to it, is kind of the new thing. And we see already in this 1903 text that we're starting to have this American obsession towards brilliance. As an early cutter, Edward Passmore, who I've seen has put patents in for some of the earliest faceting mast machines probably ever conceived, is starting to do full brilliant cuts. And this is starting to sway public opinion about what looks the best. So a few years later, 1912, we've got another book. This is Gemstones by G.F. Herbert Smith. So G.F. Herbert Smith worked for the Natural History Museum in London, and it's a really good book about gemstones, not just cutting, but gemstones in general. But he also gives us some information on the cutting ideas of the time. He doesn't specifically talk about the mixed cut, but he does show us some drawings of different step cuts, as we can see here. He tells us that a popular style of cutting which is much in vogue for colored stones is the step or trap cut, consisting of a table and a series of facets with parallel horizontal edges, above and below the girdle. In recent jewelry, however, the top of the stone is often brilliant cut. The contour may be oblong, square, lozenge, or heart shape, or have less regular forms. The table is sometimes slightly rounded. Since the object of this style is primarily to display the intrinsic color of the stone and not so much a brilliant play of light from the interior, no attempt is made to secure total reflections at the lower facet. The stone therefore varies in depth according to its tint. If dark, it is cut shallow, lest light be wholly absorbed within, and the stone appear practically opaque. But if light, it is cut deep in order to secure fullness of tint. So again, we can see 1912. There's still a lot of play, and it's still somewhat of a new idea to be mixing these two styles, but it's definitely starting to happen more and more, as we can tell by all the references that we're finding. Okay, one interesting thing that I wanted to note, if we look at the Handbook for the Amateur Lapidary. So this is the first book about cutting ever written in America. This is 1935, and I find it interesting that J. Harry Howard doesn't show us the step cut at all. He does go on a bit about brilliance, how to do the brilliant cut, and really the only stone that he shows us how to cut in the book is a brilliant cut. So we can see that by 1935, that trend that we read about with Edward Passmore cutting the full stone into brilliant has fully taken over the cutting culture of America. So by the time we get to the first book written, we don't see the step cut at all. So we're starting to transition here. Now, my final reference is going to be The Art of Lapidary by Spearson. This is a much later American book, but I wanted to check out what Spearson had to say because Spearson, though he was a San Francisco-based gem cutter, he was very much trained in the old style. He was using a jam-peg machine that looks like it's probably German, and I'm guessing he was trained by German cutters. So he gives us some description and some images of what the stones were looking like that he was working on. So he shows us some round mixed cuts, he shows us some different kinds of round mixed cuts, and he shows us some kinds of brilliance, double brilliance, and what he's calling the American brilliant. He tells us the step brilliant or mixed cut is a combination of the brilliant cut and the step cut, having a brilliant cut front with a step cut back. Forms having only 8 triangular girdle facets instead of 16 are common on the cheaper stones. So he doesn't really give us an idea about when or where or why you'd use this cut, but definitely he has it cataloged as one of his types of cuts. He also tells us, when he's talking about the brilliant cut, he says, the brilliant cut is the most popular form applied to the diamond, and nearly all other transparent stones, as well as some opaque stones, may be cut in this manner. In the transparent stones, this cut develops to a maximum the brilliance and color play when properly cut. Slight modifications of the brilliant cut may be seen from time to time. So we can see from our primary sources that the mixed cut has been a super popular stone all the way back to the 1850s, if not even earlier. So if the mixed cut is the most popular type of colored stone cut of all time, we should be able to find quite a few examples of different forms of the mixed cut. So let's check a few out. Mixed cut, 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 mixed cut. Whoa, that was a lot of mixed cuts. So as we can see, mixed cuts can come in a lot of shapes, a lot of forms, a lot of varieties, and they really are the most important and popular type of colored stone cutting because of the fact that they're combining the brilliant top, which gives us that little bit of extra movement, dance, life, sparkle, scintillation, fire, whatever you want to call it, along with the step cut bottom, which as we saw before, gives us a longer light path, allows us to save weight, increase the saturation of color, and the combination of both of these two things means we have the best of both worlds. Part of the reason why this works so well is because the crown of the brilliant has 3 tiers, right? The mains, the breaks, the stars, and then of course the table on top. So if we think about the angles of the crown, we're using maybe a 35-degree mains with a 20-degree star and maybe like a 40-degree break. So 40, 35, 20. These aren't very different than the kind of proportional relationships that we have between the angles that we use in a step cut. So we're getting just as many types of entry points, entry angles for the light to come into the stone, and we're not really losing any of our outline shapes. So there's no real sacrifice in making a brilliant crown versus a step cut crown, which helps to make a little bit of sense about why this cut became so popular. You don't really lose anything, you just gain. This is great. Now, when it comes to the bottom of the stone, as we said before, the brilliant pavilion and the step cut pavilion do change a lot. They change the length of the light path, they change how much weight you lose in the stone, and generally they're going to change how the stone looks. The brilliant cut being more shiny, more bright, the step cut being a little bit softer but still animated. I mean, if we look at a mixed cut stone versus a brilliant cut stone, we're still going to see a lot of movement and a lot of play inside of the mixed cut because there's still quite a few facets on the bottom of the stone that are still going to be flashing as we move it around. It's just not as intense, just not as bright. It's a little softer, slightly more charming in my opinion. Wherever we're at in the world, if we go to a colored stone market, whether we're in Bangkok, Paris, London, New York, Tucson, we see mixed cuts everywhere, from rubies and sapphires to garnets and tourmalines to really any kind of colored stone. You can work well with a mixed cut. So we can see from historical and our own visual stone evidence, the mixed cut is a really great cut for colored stones. It's a good compromise of our 2 favorite features in cutting, which is brilliance and color. So we're getting to keep them both with the mixed cut. So I definitely urge you, if you haven't already, give the mixed cut a try. If you're a cutter, try cutting one. If you are a colored stone buyer, maybe start to notice the difference between the mixed cut, the step cut, and the pure brilliant cut, and look and see how does each one feel? What kind of mood does it evoke? What kind of emotion does it bring to you as the viewer and lover of the stones? So that's all I've got today about the mixed cut. This is Justin K. Prim in Bangkok, signing off. Check you later.